Today I'm going to teach you how to perform a Romanian deadlift safely so that you effectively load your glutes and hamstrings without putting any strain on your lower back. So the first step is to make sure that you know how to perform a perfect body weight hip hinge so that you can load your hips and not your back. Then we can add weight and go through correct technique for the Romanian deadlift. So a helpful analogy to learn how to hip hinge is to imagine your pelvis as a bucket of water and you're trying to spill water out the front. That's what a hip hinge is. It's a movement of the hips in which the pelvis tilts forward relative to the legs, and in so doing, we stretch and load the muscles of the hip, mainly those glutes and hamstrings at the back. A key characteristic of a hip hinge is that the spine comes along for the ride and maintains a neutral position. So the spine does not extend and the spine does not round or flex as we go through it. So if this hand represents the rib cage and this hand represents the pelvis, they should remain stacked throughout the full range of motion. So let's practice that. I want you to stand with the feet hip width apart, soften the knees, and from there, place the hands on your shoulders, keeping the upper body relaxed. I want you to think about driving the hip back, driving the crown of your head forward to keep the spine long, and keep your weight evenly distributed across your feet. Let's have a go at that now. I'll do 2 reps to show you in practice. So to come back up there, I'm thinking about driving the hips forward, squeezing the glutes as if doing a hip thrust. So a few key points. The first is breathing, perhaps the most important. We want to make sure we're breathing in through the nose as we go into the hip hinge. Why? Because it creates what's called intra-abdominal pressure. Think of that as an outward pushing force against your abdomen. That is what activates your core to protect your spine and make it very resistant to bending. That's going to become very important when we start loading this movement with weight. Another key characteristic is what you should feel in that end range position. Okay, so when you get into that hip hinge, you should feel stretching and loading of your glutes and hamstrings. That's how you know you've loaded those muscles well. Lastly, what should that end range position look like? Well, you'll see there that my torso is pretty much parallel to the ground. That's what we want to aim for, but you might not have the mobility to get there right now. We have to make sure that we're only going to our end range of a hip hinge, because if you go too far, if you go past your range of motion, the next thing that's going to happen is you're going to round your lumbar spine, tuck the pelvis. And if we're under load, we're then going to shift the tension from the legs pinpointed into the low back. So it's really helpful to film yourself from the side because you can see that, you can test how well you're hinging the hips and make sure that that movement is not coming from the back. So practice that exercise often. You can do 5-10 reps daily. Once you feel you're really confident with that movement, we can move on to loading it up with the Romanian deadlift. Right, Romanian deadlifts. This is just the name for a loaded hip hinge, and there are many exercise variations. You can use dumbbells, you can use a landmine, you can use a barbell, you can do bilateral stance or unilateral stance. Today I'll show you just standard dumbbell Romanian deadlifts because I think a lot of people have dumbbells and it's a good staple exercise. And I think the best way to demonstrate how to do this is to start by actually just doing a heavy set. You can watch that, visualize it, then I'll walk you through exactly what I did. Okay, so I'm just going to do 5 reps, set the dumbbells down, and then again, I'll walk through all those steps. Okay, now I'll pick up the lighter dumbbells and walk you through the steps. We do not need straps, we do not need to load really heavy when we're learning this exercise. So, what did I do? Very similar to the bodyweight hip hinge, we're going to start with the feet hip width apart, and we're going to soften the knees. With dumbbells, a nice position is about a 45-degree angle to the thighs. So not directly here, not directly here, somewhere in the middle. From there, to enter the hip hinge, we're thinking about driving the butt back and the crown of the head forward, keeping the weight, again, evenly distributed across the feet. Breathing in through the nose, as we've discussed. Once we're in that end range position, we're going to lock it in and then drive the hips forward, squeeze the glutes, and repeat for the desired number of reps. Okay, so a couple of key points here. One is we do want some tightness in the back. Okay, so grip strongly and think about squeezing oranges under your armpits so we have some tension in the lats. They feed into the pelvis, they stabilize the back. And we don't want those dumbbells to drift too far away from the legs. So some people will say keep them glued to your legs. That's not necessary, but we don't want them to drift beyond the toes. So kind of mid-foot is going to put you in a really good position where we get nice loading in those glutes and hamstrings. So let's now go over some of the common compensations. In other words, some of the ways that your technique might be compromised. This is extremely important to understand to make sure that you're safe and you're loading the muscles as effectively as you can. So there are 4 compensations I want you to really watch out for. The first is initiating the hinge by arching the back. Okay, this is really common. A lot of people will just dump the pelvis forward, really extend. Okay, and I think it's probably because there's a bit of fear about rounding, and so it's a way of compensating for that, but it's not ideal. We're actually going to get a lot of compressive force on the lumbar spine if you do that. So if you find that you're initiating the hinge by doing this, we actually want to make sure that the ribs are down, connected to the hips, so that the torso moves as a unit. The second is shifting your weight to the heels. This happens when people are just thinking about butt back, okay? And it sends you off balance. And as you can see there, it massively limits your ability to get into a good hip hinge. So I want you to make sure you're feeling the front of your foot as much as the back of the foot, underneath the base of the toes. That way, look, you're going to be able to get into a really nice deep hip hinge position where we're stable and we've got lots of loading through the hip. So that's number 2. Number 3, going too low. Once you end your hip hinge, okay, if you keep going, you're going to be rounding from the lower back. It is really important that we don't do this. So with dumbbells, a good reference point is probably just under the kneecaps. If you're going beyond mid-shin, you're probably rounding the spine. The best way to know if you're doing this well is to be topless and to film yourself, and then you'll see that low back and find what your true end range hip hinge position is. Lastly, on the way up, this is really important. We want to make sure that we're leading with the hips. So you drive the hips forward and squeeze the glutes, okay? A lot of people will come up with the upper body and the pelvis stays behind the ribs. Now we're getting lots of compressive force down on the lumbar spine. Okay, we need to be here. We need to make sure that the hips lead and they finish underneath the rib cage. Okay, so those are the 4 compensations to watch out for. I want to leave you with 6 quick tips. Number 1, learn to generate intra-abdominal pressure. This is the most fundamental lifting skill to stabilize the spine. Number 2, learn and master the bodyweight hip hinge first before you start to load up the Romanian deadlift. Number 3, start light and build up. There is no rush to progress. Take your time, get comfortable with the weights before you start working your way up the rack. Number 4, never fail a rep. You can build muscle and strength extremely effectively by keeping a couple of reps in the tank. In fact, that's better. And it's just not worth the risk to push this to failure, because the thing that's going to fail is your spine. It's going to buckle. I've been doing this for years, never had a low back problem because I respect that. Number 5, when you get strong enough, wear lifting straps, because otherwise your grip is going to limit how much weight you can handle. I'm always banging on about this because a lot of people will just get stuck at the same weight because grip is limiting them. So learn to use lifting straps when you get strong enough that it starts to feel like your grip is fatiguing. Then you can just hammer your legs without any worries about that holding you back. Number 6, if it hurts, don't do it. Okay, we all have different body types. This is a complex lift, a complex skill, and it's, again, not worth the risk if something hurts, like your lower back. You might benefit from some more technical coaching, some one-on-one in-person coaching. There are plenty of other ways to load the hip. There's plenty of other Romanian deadlift variations that might be more effective and safer for you. Okay, that wraps this video up. I really hope you found it helpful. If you did, please give it a like. Subscribe if you haven't already, and if you have further questions and you'd like to see more videos around this topic or more how-tos, please drop that in the comments. Thank you so much for following along.